Welcome back to Untold Revenge Files. Today, the story you're about to hear takes place in Ashford, Connecticut. My name is Caroline Mercer. I'm 41, and I'm the woman my family told to sit down, stay quiet, and accept that I didn't matter. They built an entire empire on the assumption that I would never fight back. They were right about one thing. I never fought. I just waited. The boardroom at Mercer and Vail Manufacturing occupied the entire north face of the 7th floor. Floor-to-ceiling glass panels looked out over a frozen industrial campus, 14 buildings sprawling across 22 acres of Connecticut riverfront property. On a clear day, you could see all the way to the highway overpass, where the company's name glowed in blue neon letters large enough to read from a quarter-mile away. But on this particular afternoon in late January, the sky was the color of wet cement. A thin layer of frost clung to the edges of the windows. The heating system hummed through the vents, pushing warm air that smelled faintly of old carpet and printer toner. The long glass conference table reflected the overhead fluorescent lights like the surface of still water. 12 people sat around that table. At the head sat my father, Richard Mercer, 73 years old, CEO since 1989, white hair combed straight back, navy suit, gold cufflinks, reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. His hands were folded on a leather binder, perfectly still. He had the posture of a man who had never once been told he was wrong. To his right sat my brother, David Mercer, 45, Chief Operating Officer, broader than our father, louder. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, top button undone, like he was performing the role of someone modern and relaxed. His jaw was freshly shaved, and his hair was cut short on the sides, styled up on top. He had a presentation remote in his right hand and a thin smile that hadn't left his face since he walked in. To my father's left sat the corporate attorney, Philip Bancroft. Thin, silver glasses, a fountain pen always in hand. He represented the company, not the family, though most people in the room forgot there was a difference. The two aunts, Margaret and Diane, sat together on the far side. They held minority shares inherited from my grandfather. They rarely spoke at these meetings. They rarely needed to. They voted the way my father told them to vote. Always had. 3 outside investors, 2 from a real estate fund, 1 from a regional capital group, sat near the middle. Next to them sat the company's CFO, Gerald Huang. He had a laptop open and a spreadsheet projected on the wall behind him. The numbers were small, dense, and deliberately difficult to interpret at a glance. And then there was me. I sat at the far end of the table, the opposite end from my father, the farthest seat from the projector. I wore a dark green blouse and a black blazer. No jewelry except a thin silver watch. I had a single manila folder in front of me, closed. A glass of water, untouched. I hadn't spoken since I sat down. David clicked the remote. A slide appeared behind him. It read, Strategic Acquisition Proposal, Halberd Capital Partners. He stood. He spoke for 11 minutes. He said the company was hemorrhaging. He said operating margins had declined for 3 consecutive quarters. He said the manufacturing division was propped up by legacy contracts that would expire within 18 months. He used words like market recalibration and strategic liquidity event. He said the company needed new leadership, new capital, new vision. He didn't look at me once while he said any of this. Then he said the quiet part out loud. This company has suffered from outdated emotional leadership for too long, sentimental decision-making, loyalty-based promotions instead of performance-based ones. We need professionals, not family members clinging to symbolic titles. He let that hang in the air. I knew who he was talking about. Everyone knew. Then he turned to the room. I'm proposing a full acquisition by Halberd Capital Partners. They've offered $140 million, clean buyout, all shareholders compensated per their current holdings. He clicked to the next slide. A pie chart appeared. It showed ownership percentages. Richard Mercer, 34%. David Mercer, 22%. Margaret Mercer Allen, 9%. Diane Mercer Wallace, 9%. Outside investors, 18%. Caroline Mercer, 8%. 8%. David pointed at the chart. As you can see, the motion requires a simple majority. Between Dad, myself, and our aunts, we're at 74%. The outside investors have already indicated preliminary support. This is a formality. He paused. Then he looked at me for the first time. Caroline, I know this is difficult, but your 8% doesn't change the math. You're outnumbered. And to be honest, and I say this with respect, you've never contributed operational value to this company. Your shares are symbolic. They always have been. The room was silent. My father cleared his throat. He looked at me briefly. Then he looked away. I support the motion, he said. The two aunts nodded. Philip Bancroft uncapped his fountain pen. Shall I call the formal vote? David sat down, leaned back, smiled. Let's make it official. I felt the temperature of my hands, cool, steady. My heartbeat was even. The room smelled like leather chairs and coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago. Through the glass, I could see snow beginning to fall, small, dry flakes that drifted without urgency.
I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand. I just said, "Are you absolutely sure about those numbers?" The room paused. David looked at me. His smile flickered for half a second. "Excuse me?" I didn't repeat myself. I just held his gaze. Then I looked down at my folder, and I waited. Sometimes the loudest people in the room are the least informed. They confuse volume with authority. They confuse being unchallenged with being correct. And sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's preparation. Silence was my strength. Have you ever been underestimated? Not because you failed, but because you didn't fight back immediately? Have you ever watched someone take credit, take control, take everything, and known deep down that the only thing keeping you quiet was timing? This is what patience looks like when it has a plan. Let me take you back. Because to understand what happened in that boardroom, you need to understand what happened long before it. I grew up in the shadow of Mercer and Vale. Literally. Our family home sat on a hill less than a mile from the main campus, and from my bedroom window, I could see the factory lights at night, orange and white, flickering behind chain-link fences. My earliest memories are of the smell of machine oil on my father's coat when he came home late, the sound of the garage door opening at 10 p.m., the clink of his briefcase on the kitchen counter. David was the firstborn, the son, the heir. From the time he was 12, he was brought to the plant on weekends. He sat in on meetings. He shook hands with foremen and engineers. My father introduced him as the future of this company. By 16, David had business cards printed with his name and the company logo. He didn't earn them. He was handed them. I was told to stay supportive. Those were the exact words my mother used before she passed. Stay supportive, Caroline. Your brother needs you behind him. I was 14 when she said that. I remember the light in the kitchen. Yellow, warm. The smell of chicken soup. Her hand on mine. I believed her, for a while. But something shifted in my 20s. I started attending board meetings as a silent observer. I'd sit in the corner with a notebook. I asked questions. Good questions, I think. Questions about margins, about vendor contracts, about liability exposure. They were ignored. Not argued with, just ignored. My father would nod politely and move to the next agenda item. David would glance at me like I was a child who had wandered into a room full of adults. When I was 24, something happened that I didn't fully understand until years later. My father called me into his study one evening. David was there. So was Philip Bancroft, the attorney. They said the company was going through a restructuring. Something about reclassifying share types to attract outside investment. They said it was routine. They asked me to sign a temporary transfer agreement, moving my shares into a family holding trust for tax efficiency. I signed. I didn't have a lawyer of my own. I didn't think I needed one. They were my family. What I learned later, much later, was that the restructuring had created two classes of shares. Class A shares carried full voting rights. Class B shares carried limited or no voting rights. My shares had been converted to Class B during the transfer. When they were returned to me, they looked the same on paper. Same number, same face value. But the voting power had been gutted. That's how I ended up with 8% on a pie chart that was designed to make me irrelevant. The pain wasn't about money. Not really. I didn't care about the payout from a sale. I cared about being erased, about being treated as decoration in a company my grandfather built with his hands. A company I loved, not for what it gave me, but for what it meant. Anger wasn't loud. It was controlled. I didn't scream. I didn't confront them. I didn't cry in front of anyone. I enrolled in law school. I graduated from Columbia Law in 3 years. Top 12% of my class. I specialized in mergers and acquisitions, corporate governance, and equity law. I didn't tell my family. They never asked. David once joked at Thanksgiving that I was finding herself, and the whole table laughed. I smiled. I ate my turkey. I went home and studied convertible preferred share structures until 2 a.m. Silence was my strength. Over the next 10 years, I did something very quiet and very deliberate. The company went through rough patches. There were quarters where revenue dipped, moments when my father had to court emergency investors, times when smaller shareholders, employees, early backers, retirees, needed to sell their shares at a discount just to cover personal debts. I bought those shares. Not under my name. Through 3 legally registered LLCs, each one properly disclosed with the SEC, each one filing beneficial ownership reports exactly as required. There was nothing hidden, nothing illegal. It was all in the public filings, if anyone had cared to look. But no one looked, because no one thought I mattered. I purchased discounted non-voting shares and converted them when the company's own bylaws allowed it. I funded small investor buyouts during downturns. I tracked every reclassification, every proxy filing, every amendment to the corporate charter. I built a spreadsheet that mapped every share, Class A, Class B, preferred, convertible, and I updated it every single quarter for a decade. I knew that company's equity structure better than the CFO, better than the attorney, better than my father. This wasn't revenge, it was accounting. The week between the emergency meeting and the final signing was chaos. David launched a campaign. Not publicly, not yet, but internally. He called board members individually. He called investors. He told them I was emotionally unstable, that I might try to block the sale out of spite. He suggested I had a history of irrational behavior, a claim built on nothing but the fact that I occasionally disagreed with him in meetings 5 years ago. He told the private equity firm, Halberd Capital, that there was a minor family dispute, but that it was handled. Halberd's lawyers pushed for the signing to be moved up. They wanted signatures before anyone could raise objections. They scheduled the final closing for Wednesday morning at 9 a.m. My father called me on Monday night. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask what I meant in the meeting. He said, "Caroline, I need you to step down from the board before Wednesday. It'll make this cleaner." I held the phone to my ear. I was sitting in my home office. A single desk lamp lit the room. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows. I could hear the radiator ticking. "Cleaner for who?" I asked. He paused. "For the family." I said, "I'll be there Wednesday." He hung up. Tuesday night, 11 p.m. I sat at my desk with the updated capitalization table, the document that tracks who owns what in a company. I had requested a copy from the corporate secretary's office that afternoon. It was supposed to be the same document they were using to calculate shareholder percentages for the sale. It wasn't accurate. There were 3 specific errors, not small ones. First, Class B share conversions from 2019 had been misreported. 46,000 shares had been converted to Class A voting shares through a provision triggered by a dividend threshold. The conversion had been filed with the SEC. I had the receipt, but never updated in the company's internal records. Those shares were mine. Second, preferred shares I held through one of my LLCs carried proxy voting rights that activated automatically during any acquisition event. This was written into the company's own charter, Article 12, Section 4B. It had been there since 1997. No one had read it in years. Third, and this was the one that mattered most, there was a consolidation clause, buried in the amended bylaws from 2016. It stated that in the event of any outside acquisition attempt, voting rights would be recalculated based on total beneficial ownership across all registered entities, not just direct family holdings. All entities. David and his lawyers had calculated ownership based only on what appeared under individual family names. They hadn't traced the LLCs. They hadn't checked the beneficial ownership filings. They hadn't done their homework. They assumed I was 8%. They were wrong. I printed every document. I organized them in order. I placed them in a single certified binder, notarized, tabbed, and indexed. Then I turned off the desk lamp. I sat in the dark for a long time. The room was cold. I could smell the cedar from the bookshelves. I could hear the clock on the wall marking each second with a sound like a fingernail tapping on glass. I didn't feel angry.
I felt ready. Wednesday morning, 9 a.m. The same boardroom, the same glass table, the same fluorescent lights humming overhead. But the room was more crowded now. Halberd Capital had sent 3 lawyers in matching dark suits. A press liaison from the company's communications team sat near the door with a laptop, drafting the announcement. The CFO had printed final payout summaries. My father sat at the head of the table again. David sat to his right, leaning forward, a pen already in his hand. The contract was thick. Cream-colored paper, 2 copies. One for Mercer and Vale, one for Halberd Capital. Philip Bancroft cleared his throat. "We've reviewed the final terms. All shareholder percentages have been calculated. If there are no further objections, we'll proceed with signatures. David looked at me, just for a moment. There was something in his expression, not quite pity, not quite triumph, something dismissive, something that said, "You're still here?" The contract was slid across the glass table toward my father. He uncapped his pen. "Actually," I said. My voice was calm, not loud, just clear enough to carry across the room. "Before anyone signs, I'd like the corporate secretary to verify the current shareholder registry." David exhaled. "Caroline, we've been through this. The numbers are—" "I'd like them verified," I said again. I opened my bag. I placed the certified binder on the table, using this. The room shifted, not dramatically, just a slight change in posture, a tightening of attention. Philip Bancroft looked at the binder, then he looked at me. "What is this?" "It's a certified beneficial ownership registry, compiled from SEC filings, LLC registration documents, and the company's own amended bylaws. I'm requesting that the corporate secretary read the updated voting share totals into the record before any contract is executed." David turned to the attorney. "She can't delay this." Philip hesitated. He looked at the Halberd lawyers. One of them, a woman in a navy blazer, leaned forward and said, "If there's a material dispute regarding ownership percentages, it would need to be resolved before closing. We can't execute on inaccurate numbers." David's smile disappeared. My father set his pen down. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in what felt like years. The corporate secretary, a quiet woman named Linda Chow who had worked for the company for 21 years, opened the binder. She began reading. She started with the direct holdings. Those matched. Richard Mercer, 34%. David Mercer, 22%. Margaret and Diane, 9 each. Outside investors, 18. Then she reached the section I had tabbed in blue. "Beneficial ownership through registered entities," she read. Her voice was steady, but I noticed her eyebrows rise slightly. Entity 1, Greenway Holdings LLC. Registered owner and sole beneficial holder, Caroline A. Mercer. Shares held, 112,000 Class A voting shares. The room went quiet. Entity 2, Ridgeline Capital Partners LLC. Registered owner and sole beneficial holder, Caroline A. Mercer. Shares held, 89,000 Class A voting shares, plus 46,000 converted from Class B per SEC filing dated March 2019. David stood up. "That's not—" Entity 3, Linda continued, her voice unwavering. Northgate Investment Trust. Sole trustee and beneficial owner, Caroline A. Mercer. Preferred shares with activated proxy voting rights per Article 12, Section 4B of the company charter. Voting equivalents, 204,000 shares. She paused. She looked at the calculator built into her laptop screen. She typed. She looked up. Total voting shares held or controlled by Caroline A. Mercer, directly and through beneficial ownership, 82%. The Halberd lawyer leaned back in her chair and closed her folder. David's face went pale. Not slowly, all at once. Like someone had reached inside him and pulled a plug. His hand, still holding the pen, was trembling slightly. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. My father stared at me. His expression was unreadable at first. Then it shifted into something I had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not pride, something closer to fear. "How?" he whispered. I folded my hands on the table. "You taught me to protect the company," I said. "I just didn't tell you I was protecting it from you." The room was so silent I could hear the snow brushing against the windows. I could hear the HVAC system cycling. I could hear Philip Bancroft's fountain pen rolling slowly across the glass table, untouched. One of the Halberd lawyers spoke quietly to the lead attorney. The lead attorney looked at me, then at the binder, then at the contract sitting unsigned on the table. "We're going to need to pause," she said. "You're going to need to leave," I replied. Not harshly, just factually. "This acquisition cannot proceed without the consent of the majority shareholder. I do not consent." I let that sit. Then I looked at Philip Bancroft. "I'd like to call a vote. Motion to remove the current CEO and COO, effective immediately. As majority shareholder, I'm exercising my right under Article 7 of the company bylaws." Philip looked at my father. My father said nothing. His hands were flat on the table. His pen lay beside the unsigned contract like a weapon that had misfired. The vote was called. It passed instantly. I became acting chairwoman of Mercer & Vail Manufacturing at 9:47 a.m. on a Wednesday in January, in a boardroom that smelled like cold coffee and melting snow, while my brother sat frozen in his chair and my father stared at the table like a man reading his own obituary. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. The fallout was quiet. That's the thing people don't understand about corporate collapse. There are no explosions, no handcuffs in the lobby, just paperwork. Endless, devastating paperwork. The sale collapsed within the hour. Halberd Capital withdrew their offer by noon. Their lawyers cited material discrepancies in disclosed ownership structure and unresolved governance concerns. They were polite about it. Private equity firms usually are, right up until they're not. I authorized an internal forensic audit the following week. It revealed what I had long suspected. Executive bonuses had been inflated. Financial incentive reports had been misrepresented to the board. David had approved 3 separate consulting contracts with firms that were, functionally, shell companies funneling money back to associates of his. Not massive amounts, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to be reported. The SEC opened a preliminary inquiry within 60 days. Not because of anything I filed, though I cooperated fully, but because the Halberd transaction had triggered automatic disclosure reviews, and the numbers didn't match. David resigned. He didn't have a choice. His attorney advised him that staying on would expose him to personal liability. He walked out of the building on a Friday afternoon in March, carrying a single box. I watched from the 7th floor window. He didn't look up. My father retired the following month. His lawyer called it a voluntary transition. It wasn't. The board, now restructured with independent members I had appointed, made it clear that his continued presence was a legal liability. He signed the papers in his study at home. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. There were no dramatic arrests, no courtroom scenes, no shouting matches. Just the slow, methodical unwinding of a system built on assumptions. The assumption that I didn't matter, that I wasn't paying attention, that silence meant surrender. Anger wasn't loud. It was controlled. Over the next 18 months, I rebuilt the company from the inside out. I started with governance. I replaced the old board structure, which had been a rubber stamp for my father's decisions, with a truly independent board. 3 outside directors with no family ties. A new corporate attorney who reported to the board, not to the CEO. Transparent meeting minutes. Quarterly disclosures to all shareholders, no matter how small their holdings. Then I turned to the people. Mercer & Vail employed over 2,000 workers across its 14 facilities. Most of them had spent their entire careers there. They had built the company with their hands, their time, their health. And for decades, they had been treated as line items on a spreadsheet. I implemented a profit-sharing program. 10% of quarterly net income distributed across all full-time employees based on tenure and role. It wasn't radical. It was fair. Some of the senior managers pushed back. I let them push. Then I showed them the retention numbers from the first 2 quarters. Turnover dropped by 40%. Productivity increased. The numbers spoke. I created an ethical compliance division, a team of 3 internal auditors whose sole job was to ensure that every contract, every bonus, every vendor relationship was clean. They reported directly to the board, not to me, not to any single person, to the institution. And I started a scholarship fund, the Mercer & Vail Education Initiative. It provided full tuition for employees' children pursuing degrees in business law, corporate governance, or ethics. The first class had 11 students. I met each one of them. I shook their hands. I told them the same thing. Learn the fine print. It's where the truth lives. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't dismantle the company to punish my father or humiliate my brother. I didn't give interviews. I didn't write a memoir. I didn't post anything on social media. I just rebuilt. Quietly. Carefully. The way I had done everything else. There's a moment I come back to sometimes. It was about 6 months after I took over. Late evening. I was alone in the boardroom, the same room where they had tried to vote me out. The lights were off except for a single desk lamp I had brought in from my office. The glass table reflected the glow like a dark mirror. Outside, it was early summer. The river was visible through the windows, silver under a half moon. I sat at the head of the table, not the far end, the head. And I thought about my mother, about what she said to me in that yellow kitchen. Stay supportive, Caroline. I did stay supportive, just not in the way she imagined. I supported the company by learning everything about it. I supported the employees by making sure the company survived. I supported the truth by documenting every share, every filing, every clause. I supported myself by refusing to disappear. They mistook silence for weakness. They confused visibility with power. They thought that because I didn't shout, I had nothing to say. They thought that because I sat at the far end of the table, I didn't belong at the head. Real strength doesn't shout in the boardroom. It waits. It reads. It files. It builds. And when the time comes, it doesn't need to raise its voice. It just places the numbers on the table and lets them speak. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. If this story moved you, if you've ever been the person at the far end of the table, the one they counted out before the meeting even started, I hope it reminded you of something. Your silence isn't surrender. Your patience isn't weakness. And the people who underestimate you have already made their biggest mistake. If you felt something, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. We tell stories here about people who were underestimated and what happened when the world finally caught up. I'll see you in the next one.